My father grabbed my wrist so hard it left a mark, pulled me down to his hospital pillow, and whispered a name I had never heard in 34 years of being his son. Not my mother's name. Not mine. A woman's name, cracked and desperate, like he was trying to hand me something before the door closed forever. Then the machines started screaming. Nurses flooded the room, and by the time they pushed me into the hallway, my father was gone, and that name was still sitting in my chest like a stone I didn't know how to swallow. My name is Daniel Cole. I am 34 years old. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, and until 11 days ago, I thought I knew exactly who my father was. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Quiet Rise. We tell real, honest stories about the moments that quietly change a person's life forever. And if that's the kind of story you're looking for, stick around, because this one still doesn't feel finished to me, even now. Every week, we share a new story like this one, so if it means something to you, consider joining us for the next one. The name my father whispered was Marianne. I stood in that hospital hallway holding my mother's hand while she sobbed into my shoulder, and the only thing running through my mind wasn't grief. Not yet. It was that word, Marianne. My mother's name is Linda. She's been Linda Cole for 39 years. There was no Marianne in our family. No Marianne at church. No Marianne my father had ever mentioned at a barbecue or a holiday dinner or during the 1,000 ordinary conversations a son has with his father over 3 decades, and yet, with his last conscious breath, that was the name he chose. I told myself it didn't matter. My father, Robert Cole, had been sick for 8 months. A slow and cruel decline from pancreatic cancer that ate away his body, while somehow leaving his mind sharp until nearly the very end. People say strange things when they're dying. The brain misfires. Old memories surface, out of order. Maybe Marianne was a nurse from a hospital stay decades ago, or a coworker's name he'd heard on the radio, or nothing at all. Just neurons firing randomly as the body shut down. I told myself that story for exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, I was helping my mother sort through my father's things in the garage, boxing up tools he'd never touch again, when I found an old metal filing box shoved behind a shelf of paint cans, covered in enough dust that it clearly hadn't been opened in years. It wasn't locked. Inside were insurance papers, an expired passport, a folded map of Ohio with a route drawn in blue pen, and underneath all of it, a small manila envelope with one word written on the front in my father's handwriting. Marianne. My hands went cold before my brain even caught up to what I was looking at. I sat down right there on the concrete garage floor, my mother upstairs in the kitchen making coffee she wouldn't drink, and I opened that envelope like it might explode. Inside were 4 photographs, old ones, the kind with white borders, colors faded orange with age. In every single photograph was my father, younger than I'd ever seen him, outside our family albums, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. Dark hair, a warm smile, and in the last photograph, she was holding a baby. I turned that photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the envelope, were 6 words that changed everything. Marianne and our daughter, 1987. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer than a second. My father was born in 1958. In 1987, he would have been 29 years old. My parents got married in 1985. My older brother Mark was born in 1986. According to that photograph, sometime around when my mother was raising a 1-year-old in our house, my father may have had another child with another woman entirely. I didn't tell my mother that day. I couldn't. She was already drowning in grief, planning a funeral for the man she'd loved for almost 40 years, and I wasn't about to hand her a grenade with the pin already pulled. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket, closed the metal box, and told her I hadn't found anything important. That was the first lie I told her in this whole mess, and it wouldn't be the last, though not all of them would come from me. The funeral was 3 days later. I stood at that podium and gave a eulogy about a man I suddenly wasn't sure I fully knew, talking about his work ethic, his terrible jokes, the way he taught me to fix a carburetor when I was 14. All while that photograph sat folded in my inside jacket pocket, like it was burning a hole through the fabric. My brother Mark flew in from Denver with his wife and kids. He hugged me at the reception afterward and said, "He went out saying something, right?" Nurse told me on the phone. "What did he say?" I looked at my brother, 4 years older than me, always closer to our father growing up, and I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. I told him I couldn't make it out. Mumbling, I said, "Nothing clear." Another lie, and this one would matter more than I could have guessed. 2 weeks after the funeral, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my wife, Rachel, everything, laid the photographs out on our kitchen table at 11 at night after our daughter had gone to bed, and watched her face shift from confusion to disbelief to something like cautious sympathy. Rachel's a paralegal, practical to her bones. She looked at those photographs for a long time before she said the thing I'd been avoiding. "Daniel, if this is real, You might have a sister out there who doesn't know your father just died. That sentence sat in our kitchen like a fifth person at the table. I hadn't let myself think that far. I'd been so focused on what it meant about my father, about whether my parents' marriage had been built on a secret, that I hadn't considered the human being on the other side of that photograph. A woman named Marianne, who might still be alive. A daughter who might be my age or close to it, who might have grown up not knowing her father was a man named Robert Cole from Westerville, Ohio, who fixed transmissions for a living and coached Little League on weekends. Rachel asked if I was going to look for them. I said I didn't know. That was a lie too, because some part of me had already decided the moment I read those 6 words on the back of that photograph. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. It took me 3 more days to work up the nerve to start looking, and when I did, I didn't tell my mother. I told myself I was protecting her. Looking back, I think I was protecting myself, because some part of me was terrified that if I found this woman, I'd learn something about my father that would unmake everything I thought I understood about the man who raised me. I started with the obvious. Social media searches for Marianne, combined with anything I could think of. Towns near where my parents lived in the 80s. My father's old job at Whitmore Auto, nothing. There are a lot of women named Marianne in Ohio, and none of the searches led anywhere solid. I was ready to give up after a week of dead ends, sitting in my car in a parking lot on my lunch break, scrolling through search results that meant nothing. When I remembered something, my father had kept a storage unit for as long as I could remember, out past the edge of town, full of what my mother always called his junk from before. I'd never once been inside it. Growing up, it was just a fact of life, like the shed nobody used. Dad's storage unit. Nobody asked questions. I found the key in that same metal filing box in the garage, a small brass one taped to an index card that just said Unit 214. My mother didn't know I had it. I drove out there on a Saturday telling Rachel I had a work thing, another small lie stacking on top of the others. And when I rolled up that rusted metal door, dust floated in the sunlight like I'd disturbed something that had been sleeping for decades. Inside wasn't junk, it was a life. Boxers of letters, more photographs, a child's drawing taped inside a folder that said for Daddy in a shaky, uneven hand, the kind of handwriting a 5- or 6-year-old produces. There was a savings passbook from a bank that had closed years ago, showing regular deposits made every single month for nearly a decade. Small amounts, $50, sometimes $100. Always on the 5th, and there was a stack of letters tied with a rubber brill enough to snap when I touched it. I sat down on an overturned bucket in that storage unit, and I read every single one. The letters told a story my father had apparently carried alone for almost 40 years. He'd met Marianne Whitfield in 1986 at a diner near his old job, back when his marriage to my mother was, in his own words, in one letter, already cracking before it ever really started. I want to be careful here, because I'm not interested in making my father into a villain or a saint. The letters were honest in a way that surprised me. He didn't excuse himself. In one letter, dated 1988, he wrote to Marianne that he'd made a choice to stay with my mother and my brother because he believed a child deserved a father in the house, and he hated himself for the fact that meant a different child, his daughter with Mary. I found a more recent piece of paper tucked in the very back of a folder. Not a letter, just a printed page with an address on it, dated about 2 years ago. A house in Cincinnati. I didn't know if it still applied, if Marianne or Grace even still lived there, but it was the only thread I had, and I made a decision sitting on that overturned bucket that I would pull it. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think a lot of people in my position might have gone straight there, knocked on the door, and blown up whatever piece that family had built. I didn't do that. Instead, I did something that I think was either the smartest or the most cowardly thing I've done in this whole story, and I still go back and forth on which. I wrote a letter of my own. I told Rachel what I'd found in the storage unit that night, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she didn't have practical advice. She just held my hand across the table and let me talk until I ran out of words. Then she said something I've thought about every day since. Daniel, you didn't just lose your father 3 weeks ago. You're losing him again right now, a little differently, and you're allowed to grieve both versions. I wrote the letter over 4 nights, throwing out draft after draft. I wasn't trying to explain my father to strangers, because I didn't fully understand him myself anymore. I just told the truth. My name is Daniel Cole. My father was Robert Cole. He passed away 3 weeks ago from pancreatic cancer, and his last word was a name I found written on the back of an old photograph. I said I'd found letters, that I understood if this was unwelcome, that I wasn't asking for anything except the chance to know if I had a sister, and if she wanted to meet her. I mailed it to that Cincinnati address, not knowing if anyone still lived there, not knowing if Marianne was even still alive, not knowing anything except that I couldn't keep carrying this alone the way my father had. 19 days passed with no response. I convinced myself I'd sent it into the void, that the address was old, that maybe this whole thread would just quietly end the way my father had apparently wanted it to for the last several years of his life. Then, on a Tuesday evening, My phone rang from a number I didn't recognize with a Cincinnati area code, and my entire body went cold before I even answered. The voice on the other end was a woman, careful and a little shaky. "Is this Daniel? This is Grace. I got your letter." I don't think I've ever had to sit down as fast as I did in that moment. Grace's voice sounded so much like my own aunt's voice, my father's sister, that for a second I thought I was imagining the resemblance because I wanted to hear it. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. She told me her mother, Marianne, had passed away 4 years earlier from a stroke, and that she herself was 38, a school teacher, married with 2 kids of her own. She said she'd grown up, knowing about my father in pieces. Not hidden exactly, but not fully explained either. A man her mother spoke of rarely and carefully, someone Grace understood to be her biological father without ever really knowing him. She told me something that broke me a little. Every year on her birthday, for as long as she could remember, a card arrived with no return address, just a short note, and always the same closing line. "Proud of you, always." She said she'd assumed for years it might be from her father, but her mother had never confirmed it, and after her mother passed, the cards had simply stopped coming, which lined up exactly with when my father's illness had begun. I told her about the storage unit, about the drawing that said for Daddy that he'd kept for over 30 years, about the savings passbook with deposits every 15th of the month, going back decades. I heard her start crying on the other end of the line, and she said something I'll never forget. "I used to be angry that he wasn't in my life. I didn't know he was in it the whole time. Just quietly. From a distance he chose because he thought it was the right thing, even if it wasn't. That's when the story could have simply become a sad, tender resolution. A long-lost sister found some quiet Sunday phone calls going forward, maybe a photo exchange, and eventually this piece of my father's past folded gently into my present. But that's not what happened, because 2 things collided at almost exactly the same time, and both of them forced a much harder conversation than I was prepared for. The first was that my brother Mark found out. I hadn't told him anything. I'd meant to, eventually, once I understood what I was even dealing with, but before I got the chance, my mother did something I never expected, going through my father's old bank statements to close out his accounts. She found the same secret account I'd learned about from the letters, the one he'd used to send Marianne money for years. It was still active, still funded, still sending a monthly transfer. This time to Grace, because apparently my father had set it up as an automatic payment years before he got sick, one that would keep running even after his death, quietly supporting a daughter my mother didn't know existed. My mother called me in tears. Not sad tears this time, but the kind of shaking anger I had genuinely never heard from her in my entire life. She wanted to know if I knew anything about this. I couldn't lie to her face over the phone. Not about this. Not after everything. I told her everything. The photographs. The storage unit. Grace all of it, in one long, painful conversation that lasted almost 3 hours, and ended with my mother hanging up on me for the first time in my life. Mark called me 20 minutes later, and he was not calm. "You knew this whole time, and you didn't tell me. At the funeral? While I was carrying his casket, you knew he had a whole secret family." His voice cracked halfway through, and underneath the anger I could hear something else, the same thing I'd been feeling for weeks, a kind of grief that had nowhere safe to land. I tried to explain that I hadn't known at the funeral either. Not really, just a photograph and a name, that I'd been trying to understand it myself before I dragged anyone else into it. He didn't want to hear it. He said I'd made a decision about our whole family without asking anyone, and maybe he was right. The second thing that happened made everything more complicated. Grace, understandably nervous but wanting to be honest from the start, mentioned during one of our calls that her husband, a financial advisor, had looked into the situation a little. "Out of caution more than greed," she insisted, and discovered that under Ohio law, because my father had never legally acknowledged paternity in any formal document, Grace technically had almost no automatic legal standing regarding his estate. But she also mentioned, carefully, almost apologetically, that if she wanted to, she could pursue a paternity claim that might affect how my father's assets, including the house my mother still lived in, would ultimately be divided. I want to be honest with you, the way this story deserves. When Grace brought that up, my first reaction wasn't warmth. It was fear, fast and ugly, a protective instinct for my mother that surprised me with how sharp it was. I sat with that phone call, feeling like the ground had shifted again, like I'd opened the door for a sister I was starting to genuinely care about, only to watch it possibly threaten the mother I'd been trying to protect this whole time. I told Rachel that night. I didn't know what to do anymore. Every direction I turned, someone I loved was getting hurt, and it felt like there was no version of the truth that didn't cost somebody something. Rachel didn't have an easy answer this time either. Sahust sighed. Maybe the point isn't to find a way where nobody gets hurt. Maybe it's to find the most honest way through it, and let people be hurt honestly instead of secretly, the way your dad tried to do it his whole life. That sentence sat with me for days. I called Grace back, and asked her directly if she intended to pursue anything legally. She was quiet for a long moment. and then she said something that told me more about her character than anything else in this entire story. Daniel, I didn't grow up needing your father's money. I grew up needing him to show up, and he didn't. Even if I understand more now about why. I don't want to fight with a family I just found. I brought it up because I didn't want you to hear it from someone else and think I was hiding something. That's all. I believed her. Not because it was convenient, but because everything else about how she'd handled this, from the moment she called me back after my letter, told the same story. She wasn't looking for anything except to finally understand the shape of the father she'd only ever known through birthday cards and quiet bank transfers. The harder conversation was with my mother. I drove to her house 2 days later, sat with her at the same kitchen table she and my father had shared for almost 40 years, and I let her be angry at me for as long as she needed to be. She asked questions I didn't have easy answers for. Did I think my father ever loved her? Really? Or had she just been the practical choice? I told her the truth, which was that from everything I'd read in those letters, my father had made an active decision, again and again, over years, to stay with her and build the life they had, even when it would have been easier not to. That didn't erase the pain of the secret, but I think it mattered to her that his staying hadn't been an accident of circumstance. It had been a choice, repeated for decades. She asked if I wanted her to hate Grace. I told her no, that Grace had done nothing wrong, that she was as much a person my father had hurt through his silence as anyone else in this story, maybe more, because at least my mother had gotten the visible half of his life. It took my mother almost 3 weeks before she agreed to anything more than silence on the subject. Mark took longer. He didn't speak to me for almost a month, and when he finally did call, it wasn't to apologize. Not exactly. Just to say he'd had time to think, and he understood why I hadn't told him right away, even if it still stung. Grief does strange things to people, he said, and I think that was as close to peace as we were going to get for a while, and it was enough. The meeting finally happened almost 2 months after that first hospital room whisper, on a Sunday afternoon at a park roughly halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati. My mother didn't come. Not that day. She said she wasn't ready, and I understood. But Mark did. Quiet and watchful, standing a little apart at first, with his arms crossed like he was bracing for something. Grace arrived with her husband and her 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 7 and 10. And when she got out of the car and saw me standing there, she stopped for a second, just looking, like she was trying to find pieces of our father in my face, the way I'd been trying to find pieces of him in her voice on the phone. We didn't hug right away. We just stood there for a moment, 2 strangers who shared half a bloodline and an entire lifetime of a man's secret. Then say aside, you have his hands. And I looked down at my own hands and realized I'd genuinely never noticed that before, and something in my chest finally loosened after 2 months of holding my breath. Mark warmed up slower than I did, but by the end of that afternoon, I watched him crouch down, showing Grace's son how to skip a rock across the pond, the same way our father had taught both of us 30 years earlier. And I had to walk away for a minute, because I couldn't hold myself together watching it. My mother met Grace 6 weeks after that, in her own kitchen, on her own terms, and I wasn't in the room for that conversation because it wasn't mine to witness. Whatever was said, my mother came out of it different, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a version of my father in her head that was smaller and crueler than the real man, and meeting Grace had let some of the real complexity back in. I think about that hospital room a lot. The way my father grabbed my wrist and whispered a name instead of goodbye. For a long time I thought he was trying to confess something in his final seconds, unload a guilt he couldn't carry into death. But now I think it was something else. I think, at the very end, when everything unnecessary falls away, he wasn't thinking about hiding anymore. He was thinking about a daughter he'd loved from a distance for almost 40 years, whose face he probably wanted to see one more time and never got the chance to, and in that last moment, the only thing left in him was her name. We don't have easy answers as a family. Not fully. Not yet. My mother and Grace are still finding their footing. Careful and respectful. More like 2 people who survived the same storm than family exactly, though I think that might come with time. Mark calls Grace now. Not often, but enough. My daughter has an aunt she's slowly getting to know, and Grace's kids have cousins they didn't know existed 2 months ago. It's not the tidy, perfect family reunion you'd see in a movie. It's messier than that, and slower. And some days it still feels like we're all just standing in the wreckage of a secret my father carried alone for far too long, figuring out together how to build something honest out of it. But it's real. And for the first time since that night in the hospital, I understand what he was trying to tell me. Not a confession. Not a goodbye. Just a name. The one piece of the truth he'd never been able to say out loud while he had the chance. Finally spoken before it was too late for anyone to hear it at all. If you were in my position, would you have gone looking for the truth? Or let it stay buried with him? I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done, so tell me in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more honest stories like this one, consider joining us here at The Quiet Rise for the next one. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.